What's happening, everybody? Welcome back to the FreeMelon Society. I'm Eli Martyr. I'm going to share with you something that I came across in my regular day-to-day. Don't ask me how I came across this thing, but it's something that jumped out at me as potentially a helpful thing to convey to you guys regarding just how deeply entrenched the conventions and customs of the world are in our minds that prevent us from recognizing basic fundamental truths of reality, right? How we have been lied to so consistently over time, over these last several generations, that even in the most scholarly institutions, even in the most prestigious of circles, you find baked into our current paradigm of thought certain lies that have just been perpetuated for years and years and years on end. And so it can be challenging to actually get really good, clear, solid information, especially if you're going through traditional, scholastic, worldly, accepted textbooks and whatnot, okay? So again, don't ask me how I came across this, but I just did. I'm not sure how. But what we're going to do, so I'm going to share my screen here. Here's what I'd like to share. Okay, so this is the Encyclopedia of Human Evolution and Prehistory, right? Second edition. So what we're talking about is the difficulty, right, in obtaining truthful information about humanity, human beings, human origins, and what it means to be human, and the difficulty in getting information about that subject from sources that are tainted by this myopic, reductionist, secular humanist paradigm of reducing everything to the material bits and dismissing holistic understanding. Okay, so there's a section in this text that deals with omnivory. I thought, I wonder if they have anything to say about human trophism, okay? What humans eat, what this evolution encyclopedia says about human diet, all right? So I'm going to take a look at the section, or a section where they're dealing with omnivory. This is it. I believe this is it. Okay, so here we have this section on omnivory. Now, I'm going to read this, and maybe you guys can piece this together, but I'd be curious to see if you are able to tell me what's wrong with this section, okay? All right, here's what it says. Omnivory. A true omnivore eats a wide variety of food types, okay, with each of the main forms contributing significantly to the total intake, okay? Among mammals, pigs, and perhaps bears are often considered the archetypal omnivores, and this class of dietary specialists is usually not thought to occur among non-human primates. So far, so good. So far that I couldn't really disagree with that. But, in fact, the human lineage, appears to have become specialized for an omnivorous diet early in its history. And the increased use of tools for foraging and food processing contributed greatly to the success of this striking human adaptation. Okay. Now, striking human adaptation. So, what do you guys think? All right. What is there anything that stands out to you about this particular position, and particularly the way it's worded? Okay. So they've correctly stated what an omnivore is, two really good examples of omnivory, and that this class of dietary specialists, meaning omnivores, is not thought to occur among non-human primates. So primates being our closest relative, this class of omnivory is not characterized in the non-human primates, okay? All that's correct. Then all of a sudden, when they talk about humans, though, they talk about a striking adaptation for omnivory. Okay. If I were speaking to the compilers of this encyclopedia, or whoever was responsible for this particular section, here's a very, very simple simple question that I would ask. If, as is being suggested here, human beings have now evolved to be omnivores, okay? If human beings have evolved to be omnivorous, and the way that they were evolved to become omnivores was the use of tools, my question is, if we are now, okay, as a result of that, omnivores, why do we still need tools to be omnivores? Now, someone listening might say, oh, well, the reason we still need tools is because tool use is what gave us this adaptation, what allowed us to adapt our bodies to omnivory. So therefore, we would never give up tool use because that's our adaptation. Here's the problem. The problem is the consistency with which we regard the concept of biological evolution amongst all life forms on the planet and being consistent in applying that same sense of the word to humans. All right? Let me give you an example. I'll tell you what I mean. I would guarantee you, I will guarantee you that in every instance where evolutionary biology or evolutionary trophism is referred to for any life form on Earth other than human beings, I will guarantee that whenever we're talking about evolutionary biology and trophism, all right, eating, all right, what a species is designed to eat, okay, I will guarantee that in a discussion of trophism for any other species, when they talk about adaptation, they will always be referring to biological adaptations and adaptations that come intact in the physiology. They will never be talking about tool use or any sort of non-biological crutch. Okay, they will never be referring to that. In evolutionary circles, they will always be referring to some sort of inherent, ingrained biological adaptation to the food that they're eating. Okay, so I wanted to go over something here, and we're going to read from the Encyclopedia of Evolution. This is a different Encyclopedia of Evolution, but I wanted to get the definitions straight here so that we know what is generally being referred to in discussions like these, at least conventionally from evolutionary biologists. Okay, so it says here, macroevolution refers to the evolution of major new characteristics that make organisms recognizable as a new species, genus, family, or higher taxon. Divergence of an evolutionary lineage into two or more lineages has also been called cladogenesis, origin of branches. In contrast to this, all right, microevolution refers to small changes within an evolutionary lineage. Microevolution usually occurs by natural selection, but can also occur as a result of other processes such as genetic drift. Microevolution is changes in allele expression in a given population or in a given species. That certainly seems to happen, and no issues accepting that. When it comes to macroevolution, and we're talking about species jumping genuses and families or even higher taxa, well, I mean, there are plausible reasons to doubt that this can happen, and there's actual observable data to support that doubt. So, in order to, so I'm going to read from Richard Milton's book, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism. This is a fantastic book. I'd recommend people take a look at it. But we're going to read a couple excerpts from this book. In 1811, French chemist Benjamin Dessalines set up a small factory at Passy and, following the example of German chemists, made the first small quantity of crystallized sugar from sugar beets. At this time, cane sugar was a strategic material denied the French because of their war with the other European powers. So Napoleon was immensely impressed by this scientific achievement. He ordered no less than 40 factories to be set up in France. However, now that France had the capability to manufacture beet sugar, it urgently needed to find or breed a type of beet that contained the maximum amount of raw sugar. To achieve this, Bonaparte enlisted the greatest botanists in France through the Académie des Sciences. A program was begun to breed selectively those sugar beet plants which gave a higher than average yield of sugar, a program which succeeded. At first, the common varieties of sugar beet contained on average only 4% sugar, but this was rapidly improved. 5%, 10%, 15%. At 17% average yield, the sugar content of the new plants stuck, and it has stayed there to this very day. And the French discovered repeated attempts to continue crossing high yield varieties eventually resulted in the hybrids reverting to the low yields of their ancestral stock. These early geneticists had reached some kind of barrier. But what kind? Okay, so we've got some sort of genetic barrier that has clearly been reached after a certain threshold level of genetic change. And then Mother Nature just pulled out the brakes and said, nope, no more. So we have Theodosius Dobzhansky, a professor at zoology at Columbia University from 1940 to 1962, and later the University of California until the 1970s. Basically, they carried out, I'm not going to read word for word here, but I'll just summarize. They were trying to use fruit flies because fruit flies they reproduce very, very quickly. So you can see any kind of changes over time much more rapidly in fruit flies. Human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and we're very complex creatures. Whereas the Drosophila, the fruit fly, is experimentally useful because it only has 4 pairs of chromosomes and can breed new generations in less than a month. So one of the things they try to do is select a variable and try to select for that. Fruit flies have bristles, have groups of bristles, and in one stock they start with an average of 36 bristles. And by selecting for lower than normal number of bristles over 30 generations, the experimenters were able to reduce the average carried by the offspring to 25 bristles. After 30 generations, however, the line became sterile and died out. The second group was selected for higher than average number of bristles, and over 20 generations, the average rose from 36 to 56. Again, however, sterility became so common that the experiment was wound up. Obviously, says Ernst Mayr, any drastic improvement under selection must seriously deplete the store of genetic variability. And the most frequent correlated response of one sided selection is a drop in general fitness. Drop in general fitness. This plagues virtually every breeding experiment. The limit to the amount of genetic variability available in a species, Ernst Mayr termed genetic homeostasis. So I'm going to read a little bit about genetic homeostasis now. As we have already seen, ordinary subspecific variation cannot be pressed into service as the mechanism of evolution for two important reasons. First, because of what Mayr calls genetic homeostasis, the natural barrier beyond which selective breeding will not pass. And second, because the genetic program or recipe for whales is not contained in the existing genetic makeup for bears. A genetic change is needed before one can change into the other, and natural selection is not capable of initiating genetic change. Physical characteristics are controlled by genes, or groups of genes acting in concert. Sexual reproduction ensures that each new individual receives a new deal, since the genes of the parents are shuffled together and recombined like a pack of playing cards. Sometimes the new hand is very like the old one, as when a child strongly resembles one parent. Sometimes it's very different. But in every case, the new deal can be drawn only from the existing pack, just as a hand at bridge must contain some hearts, or clubs, or diamonds, or spades, no matter how much the pack is shuffled. In terms of physical characteristics, what this means is that genetic recombination can give rise to variations that are within the range for each species. A finch with a beak a little bit bigger than before, or a cow that yields more milk than before. What it does not mean is that genetic variation of the ordinary kind is capable of explaining the appearance of entirely novel characteristics. It does not explain the appearance of a wing where before there was only an arm. The genetic inheritance mechanism is merely one of reshuffling and recombination of characteristics already represented in what Dobzhansky called the gene pool of that species. Okay, so what this all means is that there are harsh limits that are placed by Mother Nature, imposed on Mother Nature on species. And when those species start to drift in some variable to where Mother Nature has this boundary, then what happens is that particular stock, it will regress, it will go back, it will not be allowed to pass further. And this problem is something that recurs throughout these types of experiments. Something that's often touted as exemplary of evolution, for some reason, is the Richard Lenski's long-term evolution experiment. And basically, Richard Lenski and his team at Michigan State University, they began experiments in 1988, and it involved the cultivation of E. coli bacteria in a controlled laboratory setting. And they marveled at a whole bunch of changes, slight changes over time to these bacteria. And we use bacteria because they reproduce very quickly, like a generation every 20 minutes or so. And so they noticed that there was adaptation to the laboratory environment, okay, changes in growth rates and nutrient utilization, okay. There was changes in genetic diversification. They also noticed the emergence of some new traits, some interesting traits, like the ability to use citrate, a new carbon source for food, due to pressures imposed on the population by the experiment. This utilization of citrate, okay, as a food source, this novel citrate digestion, it's glorified as a demonstration of evolution, but the bacteria always had this citrate digestion in the gene pool, as I read from Shattering Myths of Darwinism. It was just not being expressed for intelligent reasons, okay, in that species, or for energy conservation or efficiency. It's in the gene pool, but there's no point in turning it on if it doesn't need it, because that might be wasteful. So it's not expressed. And so what the experimenters do is they're just bringing out what's in the gene pool, not creating genetic material, because you need to be the creator to do that. Also, the Lenski experiments showed a reduction in the overall genome size of the species. So the species, as they made these changes, they also noticed that there was a reduction in the bulk size of the genome itself. They were losing genes. So you're starting to run into these limitations. Now, this experiment has been ongoing and is still ongoing today. We've gone through more than 70,000 generations of these E. coli bacteria. And to this day, those E. coli bacteria have yet to become anything other than E. coli bacteria. They are still essentially E. coli bacteria. All right? And that is not going to change. Now, 70,000 generations, what is that in human terms? How many years is that in human terms? Well, if you assume an average generation time of 25 years, okay, well, the average generation time for humans is typically 20 to 30 years, okay, depending on various factors, cultural practices, fertility rates, etc. So if you have 70,000 generations times 25 years per generation time, you're going to get to 1,750,000 years. Okay. So in human terms, 70,000 generations, the same amount of generations that the bacteria have experienced. In human terms, that would be 1,750,000 years of quote unquote evolution time. it would take 1.7 million years for humans to undergo 70,000 generations. Now, considering that Homo sapiens are supposed to have only been on this planet, just suddenly emerged out of nowhere, okay, which is completely inexplicable in terms of evolutionary change. Homo sapiens are supposed to emerge anywhere from 200 to 300,000 years ago. Now, if you can imagine that bacteria, these bacteria which reproduce daily, have generations daily, okay, extremely quickly, couldn't turn into anything other than bacteria in 70,000 generations. In human terms, that's 1,750,000 years. Well, how much evolution could we have possibly sustained in this supposed 300,000 years that Homo sapiens emerged on the planet? Now, the genus, okay, so the genus of Homo, which modern humans belong to, that is supposed to have emerged around 2.8 million years ago, with Homo habilis and later Homo erectus and all this kind of stuff. But so that seems to lend itself to a little bit more time. But I don't really want to get too much into these details, because the only reason I'm mentioning all of this is because we are supposed to have evolved from apes. Okay, this is the theory. And it's this assumption that is coloring our belief that we are now evolved into what these textbook is saying are now omnivores. Okay, but I've just gone into how there are immense problems of becoming something else, becoming something completely different, and jumping over to another family or order of classification. All right. And yeah, there you can see examples of what we call speciation, okay, which seems to be able to produce variations, all right, which are not far departures outside of what they came from, whereby groups diverge even in terms of ability to reproduce with one another, right? But in no instance has a species ever drifted outside of essentially what it is. There seem to be very strict limits on how far nature will allow that type of departure. Now, more often than not, when an animal uses a tool to eat something, it's generally going after something that is species appropriate for that animal. Of course, you have the aggressive ape social dominance or hierarchy rituals of killing competitors and eating them. Yeah. But these seem to be cultural behaviors as well, just like in humans, where we have culture and we do things culturally, not necessarily because they're in our best interest in terms of health. In evolutionary circles, they will always be referring to some sort of inherent, ingrained biological adaptation to the food that they're eating. Always talking about vast swaths of time adapting the biology, the physiology, the digestion, the chemistry, all that. Okay? Except when we're talking about humans. For some reason, this gets a pass. When we're talking about human beings now, in this encyclopedia of evolution, okay? When we talk about human beings, all of a sudden, the use of tools to do for your system what you could not otherwise do in the sense of eating behavior, okay? All of a sudden, tool use is equated to biological adaptation in the same way that they would regard biological adaptation for any other species. Humans get that same regard, even though they have to cheat in order to behave like real omnivores through tool use. Because without those tools, we could not behave like omnivores, okay? And intellectualism and using our mental gifts to do things that our actual physiology and our biology would not tolerate. Now, of course, The concept of animals using tools in order to acquire food is not a concept that's lost on me, because I know one of the other things that people will jump to immediately to say, oh, well, all sorts of animals use tools in order to get food. So what you're saying is nonsense. Okay. All right. Well, let's look at this. So we've got primates. Okay. We've got the primate family, like chimpanzees. Okay. They might use sticks to extract termites and ants from their mounds. Okay. And they'll use stones to crack open nuts, right? Hard, dense nuts. They might use a stone or something, crack that open, and then eat what's in the nut. Tons of apes do this. Using stones to crack open nuts. It's very, very, very common. Capuchin monkeys will do it. Orangutans might do it as well. Maybe if you have like a durian or something, a spiky fruit, they might use some tool to just get access to it. Birds will do this. Okay, woodpeckers, vultures will do this. Very, very, very similar thing. They'll smash stuff on hard objects, or they'll use stones to break open eggs, right? Vultures will do this. They'll use stones to break open eggs. Dolphins might use a sponge to protect their beaks from damage, from like scraping and whatnot while they're foraging on the seafloor, right? Elephants use branches to swat flies from themselves, right? Raccoons, okay? Raccoons might even wash their food in a liquid or a stream or water or whatnot. Wash their food and eat something from the trash can, whatever it is. Fries or bread. Okay, how often you see raccoons eating bread, right? Bread products. Okay, so you see this all over the animal kingdom. All right, now, here's the thing to remember about this, guys. When animals do this, when animals use tools in nature, the object of their eating instinct is not something that is offensive to their biology. They're not eating outside of the limitations of their biology or physiology. They're simply using a tool to expedite or make easier something that they could actually still eat without the use of the tool, okay? Without some sort of processing. By and large, primates are classified as frugivores, okay? Many different types of primates will eat higher proportions of vegetables and leafy greens and whatnot, like gorillas. So gorillas will eat maybe even a 50-50 split of all sorts of vegetables and lots of fruit as well. And then, of course, they're known to use sticks to extract termites from the mounds, right? We all know this. But they are categorized. Their physiology is primed, right, and optimized for fruit eating. They're a more evolved species. Now, we could probably conceive of the fact that primates have been doing this for a long time. The question is, do we all of a sudden recategorize primates as insectivores just because they're using tools to eat insects? Do we do that? Do we reclassify them as insectivores because for thousands of years they may have been using a tool to eat insects from the ground? All right? When those chimpanzees are performing some sort of socially motivated dominance ritual and they cannibalize one another, just like humans for thousands of years have been doing weird cannibalistic rituals. We don't reclassify chimpanzees as carnivores just because they use their intelligence to do things that they're not biologically optimized to do. We don't reclassify them. Whether they use sticks and stones and tools to kill each other and eat each other, or whether they don't, whether they do it with their bare hands. We don't classify them all of a sudden as carnivores just because they're doing that.
This footage shows a hippo killing an antelope stranded in a muddy lake. And this footage shows two hippos actually killing and eating a zebra. So are hippos meat eaters? The hippopotamus, also called the hippo, is a large, mostly herbivorous, semi-aquatic mammal. Hippos by nature are vegetarians. They mainly eat grass. By nature are vegetarians. By nature, they mainly eat grass. Hippos are considered extremely dangerous animals. Are not the hippos vegetarians? The reason for this aggressive behavior is that hippos are extremely territorial, meaning they kill any other animal straying into their territory.
Vultures. I talked about vultures. Vultures are carnivores. When a vulture breaks open an ostrich egg to get access to the egg and eat it, the vulture's not doing anything that it's not biologically obligated to do. It's still a carnivore. It's eating carnivorous food. It's not going outside the limitations that its own taste senses and physiology obligate it to. Using another example from the primate family, okay, they use stone tools to break open nuts. We know that there are species that are classified as gramnivores, all right, or granivores, okay? Chipmunks, squirrels, all right? Physiology optimized for eating nuts, all right. When primates use a tool to eat nuts, do we suddenly recategorize them as gramnivores? No, we don't do that. We already know that they are physiologically designated as something else other than a gramnivore. The tool use is just the behavior to either eat something that is physiologically harmonious with their endowments, or in some cases, starving animals are going to do anything to survive, right? Maybe they eat something that's just some utter rubbish that has nothing to do with their physiological obligations, and they use a tool to get access to it. That doesn't mean you recategorize them as a type of organism that might eat as a staple whatever they've temporarily used a tool to access. We don't do that. When animals are using tools to eat appropriate material or inappropriate material, one thing is for sure, they are certainly not cooking or processing that food, right? So they're not taking in stuff that they reject completely outright. So when a human being, for example, uses cooking and processing, these are tools, cooking and processing and high heat treatment to transform what would otherwise be an absolutely disgusting and unpalatable, densely fibrous root from the ground, right? Like a tree root or something like that. We don't reclassify human beings as herbivores, for example, right? We don't do that. Eating dense, fibrous roughage is fairly objectionable to our more highly evolved, delicate senses. Okay, we're not herbivores like horses or cows. Okay, we're not herbivores who have digestive physiology and gifts to deal with dense grains and fibers. Okay, that's another classification. And when we use cooking and processing tools in order to access those things, or cooking and processing tools to access animals, okay, in a way that our biology and physiology either are incapable of or senses are in rejection of, either one, okay? When we do that, we're not staying in our lane. We're violating the restrictions that our biology, that nature is hoping your biology imposes on you. Other animals, when they use tools, they are not doing this. They are still staying in their lane. They're just using the tool to expedite the process. That's the difference. But at the end of the day, despite tools being used in nature, those animals are never associated with a diet that is discordant with their design as a result of the tool use. That is the problem. It is consistency. They are not applying the same consistent rules, okay, and restrictions and limitations which they impose on the concept of evolutionary biology to all life forms. Those same restrictions, they do not apply them to human beings. Why? Why are they not doing this? Because they have to justify the conventions, traditions, superstitions of human culture. And it is so baked into our minds that we don't even realize that we're making encyclopedias with an inherent baked-in lie. All right? And it is so glaringly evident. See, now that I pointed out to you, I'm sure that you can see how just insultingly obvious this error is. Why are we still using tools if we are now biologically and physiologically omnivores. They talked about warthogs, pigs, bears. Do you see any other pigs or bears out there requiring skillets and seasonings and shotguns and food processing machinery to eat their omnivorous diet? Do you see that? No, of course you don't. No, of course you don't. Why? Because they're actually omnivores. They don't need tools. They don't need crutches to cheat their biology and to do things that their biology does not call for. Okay, do you guys understand what I read this? It was irksome. This is an encyclopedia. This is supposed to be one of those sources that you can just pour your faith into and know that you're being told the truth. All right, let's share my screen now, and we're going to go here. Okay, let's go Encyclopedia Britannica. Encyclopedia Britannica, here we go. What do we want to search for? Evolutionary adaptation. Okay, let's see what the Britannica says about adaptation. Yeah, here we go, adaptation. In biology, the process by which a species becomes fitted to its environment, it is the result of natural selections. By the way, I should say, as I'm reading this, I'm just reading this, okay? I'm not necessarily saying that this is correct or true, this macrobiological Darwinian evolution. I am not suggesting that this is actually how life works. I'm just reading. It is the result of natural selections acting upon heritable variation over several generations. Organisms are adapted to their environments in a great variety of ways in their structure, physiology, and genetics. Physiology, genetics, locomotion, or dispersal in their means of defense and attack, in their reproduction and development, and in other respects. The word adaptation does not stem from its current usage in evolutionary biology, but rather dates back to the early 17th century when it indicated a relation between design and function. A relationship between design and function, kind of like a hammer is designed to hammer things, and it functions as a hammer should, given its design. Two go hand in hand, right? Or how something fits into something else. Okay, how something fits into something else, yes. In biology, this general idea has been co-opted. I see. In biology, this general idea has been co-opted so that adaptation has three meanings. First, in the physiological sense, okay, blah, 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 blah. Second, and more commonly, the word adaptation refers either to the process of becoming adapted or to the features of the organism that promote reproductive success relative to other possible features. Here, the process of adaptation is driven by genetic variations among individuals that have become adapted to, that is, have a greater success in a specific environmental context. A classic example is shown, okay, so they're giving an example of what they mean by this, okay? The melanistic dark phenotype of the peppered moth, which increased in numbers in Britain following the Industrial Revolution as dark-colored moths appeared cryptic against soot-darkened trees and escaped predation by birds. Okay, so that would be an example of a superficial microbiological adaptation, right, of moths. However, this episode in history, again, there was a lot of tomfoolery going on with the creation of this peppered moth incident. A lot of these photos you might think are just photos of moths, but some of them are dead, pinned onto trees, right? The third or more popular view of adaptation is in regard to the form of a feature that has evolved by natural selection for a specific function. See, this sentence, and even number two, okay, the second and more common use of the word adaptation, in these, in terms of subtext, you could squeeze in a rationale for, well, they could also be referring to something non-biological, where it's just something that the species does, which is a feature of it that allows it to survive, right? You could argue that. But the thing is, then they give an example. That's the thing. They give an example of what they mean. So in this third and more popular view of adaptation, right, is in regard to the form and feature that is evolved by natural selection for a specific function. Again, this Again, seems to very strongly be suggesting biology. But just in case we want to try to weasel in, oh, that can be any kind of adaptation, even in behavior, non-biological, they give an example. Examples include the long necks of giraffes for feeding in the tops of trees, the streamlined bodies of aquatic fish and mammals, the light bones of flying birds and mammals, and the long dagger-like canine teeth of carnivores. All the examples used to characterize this way that the term adaptation is used has to do with biology. Okay, here we go. Check this out. So we are looking at, this is just another example. Let's take another encyclopedia and see what they say about adaptation. This is the Encyclopedia of Evolution. I've been through this once before here. So there's a huge section on adaptation, okay? Adaptation is the fit of an organism to its environment, which allows successful survival and reproduction. An adaptation is often described as having the appearance of design, as if characteristics had the purpose of allowing the organism to more successfully survive and reproduce. However, scientists consider adaptations to be the product of natural selection, rather than of a higher intelligence. Adaptation can refer either to the characteristic itself or the process that produced it. Basically, okay, this goes on to give a whole bunch of definitions and a whole bunch of ways that the term adaptation is applied. But if we get to the end of the section, closer to the end of the section, okay, this is what it says about true adaptations, okay? It says, the only true adaptations, according to many evolutionary scientists, are the genetic changes that result from natural selection favoring those actual traits. Okay, that seems pretty clear to me. We're not talking about lifestyle behaviors and tool use. We're talking about actual genetic changes. Okay. For each of the preceding 8 definitions, the term adaptation can refer either to the evolutionary process, natural selection, or to the product. This leads to 16 meanings of adaptation, as explained above. However, much clarity is achieved by restricting the use of the term to just 2. The process and product of evolution acting directly on a characteristic. Okay? Now, in case there's any ambiguity, in case we want to somehow squeeze in the possibility that this could also include things like pressure cookers and all that. Okay, in most cases, a characteristic is not an adaptation with just a single function. Most characteristics are adaptations with numerous evolutionary causes. For example, so they're giving us an example of what they mean by this. The glands within an animal's epidermis. Okay, a biological thing, are an adaptation with several functions. Okay, cutting to the end. Molecules in sweat can also serve as chemical communication between animals. Mammary glands are modified sweat glands. Sweat glands, therefore, are an adaptation to at least 4 different functions. Okay, talking about sweat glands and real biology and physiology. We are not talking about tool use. We are not talking about some animals' mammary glands actually changing at the genetic level because it's using some sort of tool to access food that its biology doesn't obligate it to eat. So, I don't have much more to say about this because there's nothing more to contribute to this. It's very clear. Anytime we talk about adaptation or evolutionary biology, we are always referring to physiology and organic matter. The only exception where we do not make reference or we do not by default, like we do with all the other examples of life, the only time we do not by default imply biology and physiology is when we are talking about humans. And that is a glaring inconsistency in thought, in thinking, in logic. You have to apply the same standard. And the reason we don't apply that standard is because the foundations of what we've come to believe we are, what the world is promulgating that we are, would crumble like a house of cards. That's why we don't apply the same standard. We don't apply the same standard because if we did apply the same standard, you might be stricken by something in line with the truth. That's why. That's why this ridiculous encyclopedia is telling you that human lineage appears to have become specialized for an omnivorous diet because of tool use. And they can't recognize that we're still using those same goddamn tools today. We're in fact using more tools to be omnivores. But how can we be omnivores if we need tools in order to eat an omnivorous diet? God, it's so insultingly obvious. It's just so obvious. So, if you are not omnivores, which obviously you can't be, there's no more discussion. There's no discussion here. If you are not physiologically and biologically omnivorous, then what are you? Well, again, this is not new. Well, it's been understood forever. But more prominently in its more overt face with the natural hygiene movement of the 19th century, it was well understood that human beings are primarily a frugivorous species with the ability to consume fruits, herbs, vegetables, right? Soft leafy green vegetables and nuts and seeds. These are the foods that our biology allows us to eat correctly and with relish, without cheating, without doing anything. The same trophism that characterizes all of life. And so you fit harmoniously into the design of life, right? When you eat in this manner, that's what you are. I'm sorry, if people have an issue with that, you don't understand the body you're in. I'm sorry. And for people that want to rationalize that tool use creates biological adaptation, how do you respond to this? Does me donning a spacesuit make me biologically, evolutionarily adapted to be a space dweller? Does my donning of a scuba suit make me an evolutionary, biologically adapted aquatic species just because I put on a scuba suit and maybe I've been doing it for hundreds of generations, right? At what point will I actually develop gills and fins to be an adapted aquatic species? When will that happen? The answer is never. The answer is never. And so if you're using tools in order to cheat your biology, your biological limitations, I have news. You're not what you're trying to emulate. You're still... I don't need to say more. But I'm telling you, if I were to teach this to an elementary school child, they'd be able to know the difference between omnivore and whatever you are. Easy. Okay. But again, the world has to catch up to how simple and easy God has made it to think clearly about what you are. You just need to be honest, just common sense. So that's all I have to say about this, guys. And I hope that gave you a good example of the difficulty that is set before you when you go and try to obtain knowledge and you seek the sources of conventional knowledge out there in the world. You have this difficulty. You have the errors of human culture that are interwoven into the type of data that we're getting from these scholarly institutions. And that is a huge challenge. And it means that you have to have correct thinking, correct logic, rooted in the principles of God and the principles of nature, so that when scholarly institutions come after you with this nonsense, you're going to be safeguarded by your understanding of principle. Guys, thank you very much for your attention. Subscribe to the FreeMelon Society if you like videos like this, and we'll see you on the next one. Okay? I love you very much. Well, take care.